Hi, welcome back. Valentine's Day is upon us in about 2 days, and I'm making this video to try to establish which is the most romantic language between English and French. So I'd like to try to establish somewhat seriously which is the most romantic, French or English, because we know that French has the reputation as a language of love, but even as a bilingual, I never quite got why. It's not that I don't consider French to be romantic, but I don't see why that reputation doesn't fall upon English, because even as a French teacher, I find more arguments in favour of English. So I welcome your comments, because I'd like to figure this out once and for all. Why is French romantic? So please do tell me in the comments, why do we think that French is romantic? My name is Chris, I am a French teacher. I'm going to lay out my arguments for you, and hopefully we'll get to the bottom of this. One possible answer in favour of French is the historic role of French as the language of diplomacy, and possibly some literary works such as Madame Bovary, also the effect of Paris, and maybe a perception of a certain elegance and refinement. But is this enough to label a whole language as romantic based on a couple of books? Maybe more than a couple, but and a city? Is it enough? Because if you look at the leading men in French cinema, it's hard to find men of, shall we say, refinement and class, such as Sean Connery, Michael Caine, Robert Hardy, Cary Grant. I know it's all relative, but hopefully you know what I mean. And in America, of course, we have Vincent Price, Paul Newman, James Stewart, Humphrey Bogart, and Clark Gable, and so many others. If the reputation comes from anywhere, I don't think it's from French cinema. When I think of French cinema, I think of Gérard Depardieu, Jean-Paul Belmondo, Jean Reno, Bourvil, Louis de Funès, Pierre Richard, Galabru, Michel Galabru, Jean Lefebvre, Jean Gabin. I don't see necessarily many, how shall I put it, sexy, is that the right word, male actors that would have contributed to the reputation of French. So I wouldn't say it comes from the cinema, or at least not from men. I don't see the equivalent of a Paul Newman in French cinema. So perhaps it rather comes from the female actors, such as Michel Morgan, Catherine Deneuve, Simone Signoret, or even Brigitte Bardot. I really don't know. But going back 200 years, well before the golden age of cinema, to the development of the literary current, the Romantic movement, I think that someone like Lord Byron, for one, was very romantic. He was actually so romantic, he was a little too romantic. He had to flee England, such was he involved in a collection of scandalous relationships. We're talking about divorces, affairs, and did he not make Don Juan famous in one of his poems? He was indeed so romantic, Lord Byron, that he raised his own army to help the Greeks in their war for independence. He funded his own army. I mean, who does that? You'd surely need to have a lot of heart and a lot of passion to do that sort of thing, surely. If you've never heard of Lord Byron, the writer, he's an eccentric millionaire that would make Motley Crue look like choir boys. And what about Shakespeare? I mean, didn't he write the play of all plays synonymous with romance? Romeo and Juliet, the quintessential play of romance. It seems somewhat unfair to me that the English language gets forgotten in the discussion about romance. On the other hand, it's easily understandable why. If you think of England, you think, what do you think? You think cold cottages, no comfort, cups of tea, slices of toast, bad food, mist, walking dogs in the countryside, in the fields. I can understand that it's not the ideal premise to a romantic setting. However, we could also say that the very activity of walking one's dog in the countryside is synonymous with a connection with nature, and it's probably this connection that enabled Britain to develop such a meaningful collection of romantic poets. We mentioned Lord Byron already, but we could have mentioned Wordsworth, Coleridge, Keats, Shelley, and others. And I would say that British people have that connection with the land and with one another, thanks to nature, just as much, of course, as any French person might have. Perhaps another reason why Britain gets overlooked in this discussion is the Victorian era up to the early 1900s, and in particular the role of the woman as the angel of the house. Of course, women were limited to the domestic sphere only instead of the public sphere, but we saw that in other countries also. It's not typically a British thing. We saw that in other countries of Europe, and I wonder if it was more of a necessity within the partnership of marriage than really a philosophy. One was in the factory, in the public sphere, and women stayed behind to keep the house in order. I really don't think it was a particularly unromantic British philosophy is what I'm saying. It was more about necessity, and as I mentioned, we did see this in other countries also. And besides, historians later showed us the Victorians got up to all kinds of tomfoolery and were also very creative people and good-humoured. So it wasn't the rigid period of abstinence we sometimes equate with the Victorian era. But maybe it's in this context that people started to imagine candlelit dinners in Paris and imagine that the average French person walked around dressed like a Versailles nobleman on tiptoes, reciting poetry all day long, wearing one of those white wigs and wafting themselves with a little fan and whatnot. I don't know. Let's leave culture behind now and talk about the difference between French and English purely linguistically. Because when I think of the English language, I think of the colour red for some reason, and maybe you do too. I can picture the word love written in bold red letters that remind me of something warm. It reminds me of Christmas cards and Santa and red baubles, and it reminds me also of kissing under the mistletoe, which is also a very romantic practice, which to my knowledge doesn't exist in French. We could also ask ourselves if on the level of the language there exists a specific vocabulary to speak of the things of love in French and in English. Perhaps there's a whole series of words in French to describe feelings or emotions and that surpasses the English language. But we're off to a bad start here because French doesn't even have a word for loving. No, they don't. They have the word aimer, which means to like and to love. You can use j'aime in the case of a cup of tea, I like a cup of tea, or you can use j'aime in the case of loving a person. I mean, it's a bit problematic, I find. If Mrs. Green, for example, ever said to her husband, j'aime notre nouveau laitier, I like/I love our new milkman, it would be quite an ambiguous statement. And if the same Mrs. Green wanted to make up with her husband after this unfortunate remark, well, she wouldn't be able to hug him. At least not if she spoke French. There is no word for hug in French. And she wouldn't even be able to cuddle with him either because the French language doesn't consider it a thing. And if this was the Victorian age and Mrs. Green had to stay home while Mr. Green went off to work, well, Mrs. Green wouldn't be able to wave at him because the word doesn't exist in French. People just leave without saying anything. So there are no hugs, no cuddles, no waves. And in the case of a hug, we can use the word embrace, embrasser. Then again, you can't really say viens on s'embrasse, come I'm going to embrace, or to say come we're going to have a hug, or je veux une embrassade, I want an embrace. To say I want a hug, it really doesn't work. Also, when I think of the word love in English, it's a word that you can say in all sorts of situations because of the intonation of the English language, which you can't do in French. In French, it rather sounds like a heavy and clunky statement that you just can't throw out there any way you want. I've actually never heard the sentence je t'aime. I've literally never heard it. I don't even know if people say it to each other. I think when they do say it, it's once in a lifetime or in very grave and solemn moments. But in English-speaking families, you'll pick up the phone, you say goodbye, say I love you, I love you. We're always saying I love you for no particular reason, just because it's sort of a statement, I'm close to you, I love you, I appreciate you. You can't just say that in French. You can't hang up the phone and say je t'aime, it doesn't work. Je t'aime, you can't say it lightly because the intonation of French doesn't work in this way. In English you can say, sorry, I love you, love you, love you, and the intonation makes people understand it's a very light statement. Love you, love you, love you too, love you. You can say it all the time. So we're always saying love in English, but not so in French. Because the intonation is a lot more regulated and a lot more rigid. You can't say je t'aime, je t'aime. It doesn't work that way. It's a very solemn statement. The French vocabulary is surprisingly vague in this, since embrasser means both kissing on the mouth and hugging someone. So it can mean hugging with a kiss included or not. And you'd think for a supposed romantic language, they'd have a highly developed lexicon for this sort of thing, which they don't, of course. Two presidents can embrasser in full view of everyone at the airport, but two teenagers can also embrasser behind the bike shed in school. It would be the same thing. Well, it would be very different, but it is the same word. I feel that so far, in what we've discussed, English has the definite upper hand in terms of the vocabulary used and the warmth. We're talking about loving, liking, the difference between loving and liking, hugging, cuddling, kissing and embracing. I think that English wins this round. Going back to Mrs. Green, it's hard to imagine even how she would even have gotten with Mr. Green, because she wouldn't have been able to have a crush on him. There is indeed no French word for having a crush. And the list is starting to grow quite long in terms of the vocabulary that's missing in French to speak about the things of love. I think that in English, a crush, having a crush on someone is a beautiful word. You can also fancy someone. You can't say these things in French. Doesn't exist. There's no way to say it. In English, you can also be seeing someone, or you can be dating someone, and there are many half steps in English to enable the romantic game to happen, which you can't do in French. The French language even had to borrow recently the word dating from English. One thing I find particularly interesting as a language teacher is that you can easily flirt in English. English is a very flirty language because of the very rich subtext that's included in English but not in French. It's not the same type of language. And I've said many times that English is all about how you say things, not exactly what you say. But French is exactly the opposite. It's what you say. What you say is what you mean, essentially, in French. And it's a lot more analytical and factual. French is a lot more analytical and factual. So flirting in French becomes very hard. Another word which, incidentally, they borrowed from English also, flirter. Not to divulge too many things about Mrs. Green's personal life, but it is said that when she met Mr. Green, he was at the time a mechanic and he was servicing her car. That was before they were married. And Mrs. Green, being quite the flirter, said to Mr. Green, "I've got a few things under the hood that could use some attention. I bet you've revved up a few engines in your time. Or I wouldn't mind having my engine purr like that, if you see what I mean." In English, we could literally take any sentence and make it sound flirty, just because of the nature of English. Like, you could tell your local fishmonger, "I wouldn't mind paying you for some extra fish," if you see what I mean. You could make it sound flirty. It just sounds flirty without any reason for being so. And same goes for, is that an umbrella in your pocket, or are you just happy to see me? Or the secretary suggesting they go over their figures after work. In French, all these things just wouldn't work. Just because of the nature of the French language, all these things don't work. And I even question the very existence of the sexual innuendo in French. It quickly sounds corny, which it doesn't in English. I think in English it sounds adorably corny. There's a difference there. It's really very different. And it seems that there's a very vast gap in the French vocabulary to speak of people we love also. Like to speak of your loved ones, you know, when you refer to your loved ones, your family, there's no word to say it. You know, if the people you care for, your friends, they become your loved ones in English. And in French you'd have to say your close ones, les proches, which is not exactly the same. There's no les personnes que j'aime. It's not the same thing. So in English you have your loved ones. It's not exactly the same, my close people. We mentioned dating already in the English-speaking world and in the French-speaking world. The word dating, that the French have reintroduced or introduced into their language. And before that, it was un rendezvous. That's the word that was used. Un rendezvous, but that means a meeting. It could be a romantic meeting, a business meeting. It was all the same word. And you could have gone, of course, to un rendezvous galant. It might have been used, but it is dreadfully old-fashioned and outdated, which essentially means that for a very long time, well, if you went on a date with someone, you went to a rendezvous, you went to a business rendezvous. It wasn't a date. There wasn't a proper word to refer to the meeting of two people who loved each other. In French, as opposed to English, it's as if there were no gradual steps in the process of courtship. In English, you can ask someone, for example, are you with Tom now? And they might answer, no, I'm just seeing him. But in French, they'd say, well, what do you mean? You look at him? What do you mean you're seeing him? It really doesn't exist in the French-speaking world. In English, we know very well what it means. I'm seeing him. I'm not with Tom. I'm just seeing him. And we can also answer in English, well, you know, I think I fancy him. You know, there's caution. There's sort of a half step that might lead to feelings of love. You know, there's really an idea of progression, which I find personally very romantic in the English-speaking world, which you don't have in French, sorry. We're halfway through the video, and this is a Valentine's Day promo to celebrate Valentine's Day. I'll do you 5% off your next purchase, French classes off wecommunicate.com. One offer per student, of course, and the offer is valid until the 16th of February 2025. Head off to wecommunicate.com until the 16th of February 2025. Thank you for watching this far. Let's go back to the video. The same goes with the title that we give to people on whom we bestow our affections. So we have boyfriends, girlfriends, good friends, just a friend, partner, a fling, a lover, a bit on the side, friends with benefits, a roll in the hay, a paramour. So there's a whole vocabulary, and you don't go straight to a relationship as you tend to in French. There are many half steps in the English language. French did used to have the word courtiser or faire la cour, which are now dreadfully outdated. No one would ever use that, but strangely that the English language never gave up. And you don't, in the English language, you don't skip that step altogether. There's still a sense of romanticism involved before the relationship is final. In French, even the word fiancé has disappeared. But in English, we can use it not just before marriage, you don't necessarily have to be engaged, but to say publicly that it's a privileged relationship. You know, you'd say to people, he or she is my fiancé. In French, the same word would cause giggles. It really would, because it would sound so corny and so quaint. If you showed up with someone and said, c'est ma fiancée, it really would sound quaint, outdated. It would sound provincial. It really would. Even the terms of endearment in French I find quite cold. They are comparatively cold. We say mon chéri, ma chérie, which means my cherished. You know, it doesn't exactly get the blood boiling, does it? You know, hello, my cherished, how was your day today? Seems a bit, you know, cold. But the same term could be used for children also. You know, grandparents might say, oh, mes petits chéris, my little cherished. So it's not exclusive to a romantic partner at all. In English, as much as you can pick up someone in a club if you get lucky, I think there's nothing quite as dreadful as the word draguer in French. It's just the worst word that is untranslatable into English. So draguer roughly means putting on a show of sexual bravado in the hope of gaining the approval of a chosen mate, in the hope of a one-night stand or anything short-lived. It's not quite the equivalent of chatting up. That's what draguer means. So it means, well, moving forward towards one or several unwilling participants and throwing at them any low-level nonsense that goes through your mind. But no one would ever admit to draguer in French. No one would ever say, oh, on a bien dragué ce soir. No girl says, oh, I saw Pierre the other evening, j'ai vu Pierre l'autre soir, ah, bah, il m'a bien dragué, hein? J'étais bien contente. Hein? In English, this word means to dredge. It comes from the fishing vocabulary, so it means to dredge, which means pulling a net on the seabed to see what we might catch. So it's not very romantic, is it? I don't think so. Dreadful word, dreadful. That's what draguer means. Because the difference is, a couple that's now married could say, oh, you remember our younger days when you tried to chat me up, and it's not something that you would necessarily hide. But in French, it's, oh, tu te souviens quand tu essayais de me draguer, quand tu me draguais, it doesn't hide a very noble intention. Yeah, that's the main difference, I would say. Anyway, let's move on. On another topic, even in love letters, we see a strong difference between English and French. In English, you can sign off your letters with cute little X's, and even in text messages that mean kisses. I think it's very sweet, it's really lovely. But of course in French, the same letter X means top shelf literature, or un film X, as they say, so it could refer to a video or a magazine. They don't have that in letters. You can't sign off a letter in French with little X's. It just doesn't exist, which of course makes English more romantic once more. It's also interesting in French that you can't be heartbroken. Your heart just doesn't break. You can have a chagrin d'amour, right? On the other hand, chagrin is what little kids feel. It's a little kid sadness, un chagrin d'amour. And they don't have heartthrobs either. It just doesn't exist in French. When we look at the adjectives available in English, a person can be dishy, cute, gorgeous, lovely, handsome, attractive, fit. And these are all warm and very emotional words. And in French, they stay to beau and belle. That's really what you have to play with. You can say, or even bon and bonne, which means something else entirely, and has been distorted to something quite vulgar. So there isn't the same supply of adjectives as you have in English to describe an attractive person. Still thinking of Mrs. Green, she can refer to her husband as her soulmate, her better half. Delightful words, but French can't do that. Ma meilleure moitié would sound a bit odd. It would make no sense. It would be like my better half, left or right. It would make no sense. A soulmate is simply said mon âme sœur, my sister spirit, even if it's for Mr. Green in this case. At this stage, I still fail to see why it's French that's seen as the language of love, even though it has the lesser vocabulary and certainly less subtle practices when it comes to dating. Someone told me recently that one possible explanation for the reputation of French comes from the 1930s and one actor in particular, Charles Boyer. So he was a French actor who made it big in Hollywood in the 1930s and may have convinced generations of Americans that he represented the average Frenchman. And the same was shown in the cartoon Pepe Le Pew, so I don't know if that's true or not, but apparently it all comes from Charles Boyer. But whatever the cultural reasons are, and as much as I enjoy the French language and as much as I enjoy teaching it, I still fail to see why French has that reputation. I'll finish this video on a thought I have, is that the reputation of French as seen by Americans and Brits might not be the same, because I'm thinking of the legendary rivalry between the Brits and the French, and it seems that in popular culture, at least on the British side, they don't particularly consider the French to be romantic, but rather promiscuous. And there is a difference here, of course, because the French were often stereotyped and portrayed as perfume-wearing womanizers who smoked cigarettes and didn't shave, and Serge Gainsbourg, of course, perfectly embodying this. I'd say that this British stereotype about the French lasted until about the 1980s, and they also used to say that the French didn't wash for some reason. It's a thing that the Brits used to say, that the French didn't wash, and you see that you see this in BBC series such as Allo Allo, when the René had affairs with all his waitresses, and I remember that there was an episode of Blackadder, of course, with Rowan Atkinson, and he made a reference of having to go to France and wearing perfume, and because it wasn't the British thing to do when he had to go to France for whatever reason. And also in 40 Towers with John Cleese, there's the flirty French guest, the woman, Mr. Faulty. So some of you might remember this, and so poor Basil couldn't shake her off. So there are a few examples of the British perception of the French. I think that as far as Britain goes, at least, France rather more has that reputation for infidelity, which I find quite funny. And as to how it became the language of love, your guess is as good as mine. I'd love to know what you think. Thank you very much for watching this video. I'm Chris. Bye.